This is Pet Life Radio. Let's talk pets.
Welcome to Aquariumania on Pet Life Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Roy Anong, speaking to you from the University of Florida's Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory in Ruskin, Florida. Thanks for joining us. Old World Cichlids, comprised primarily of fish from Africa, are a large and very diverse group of fish in the aquarium hobby. Aquarium enthusiasts are familiar with many of the beautifully colored species from Lake Malawi and Lake Tanganyika, including the peacock cichlids, red zebras, and brichardi. These same fish also hold great interest for scientists because of their fascinating reproductive biology, ecology, behavior, and evolution. Laif DeMason, a well-known importer and breeder of African cichlids, is the owner of Old World Exotic Fish Incorporated and is based in Homestead, Florida. Laif has been breeding cichlids since 1969 and currently specializes in production and importation of African cichlids. Laif has authored numerous aquarium fish articles and writes a regular column for Cichlid News entitled, What's New Around the World? So join us as we talk to Laif about his business, his favorite fish, and what hobbyists need to know to succeed with these species. We'll join Laif right after these messages from our sponsors.
Molly, here's your dinner. Zeus, that's not your food.
Don't let that happen to your precious cat. Elevate your cat's eating experience with the Cat Tree Tray. The Cat Tree Tray keeps your cat's food off the floor and conveniently located on the cat tree. It's the perfect way to eat. It's a beautiful wrought iron tray that easily attaches to your cat tree and keeps dogs and other critters out of your cat's dish. A must for multi-pet households. There's a 6-inch tray for large bowls and a 4-inch tray for smaller bowls. Purchase your Cat Tree Tray today. Go right now to cattreetray.com. That's cattreetray.com. cattreetray.com.
Let's Talk Pets on PetLifeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Aquariumania on Pet Life Radio. My guest today is Laif DeMason, owner and operator of Old World Exotic Fish Incorporated, based in Homestead, Florida. Hi, Laif. Thanks again for joining us today.
Hi, Roy. Thanks for inviting me. It's good to be here.
So you've been involved for such a long time, I know, and have a pretty great reputation in the hobby. When did you actually first get involved in the hobby?
I started keeping fish when I was the summer before I went to high school, so that was in 1969. That's when I actually started with fish. Before that, I didn't really keep much fish. I kept other animals, but not fish.
And what was your very first fish?
Well, I sort of took over my younger brother's aquarium, which he was about, I guess he was around, well, he's younger than 6 years old, but the first fish in that community tank were white cloud mountain fish, head and tail light tetras, Leporhinus fasciatus. There were some small ones. We had 4, and they actually lived for over 10 years, and some angelfish.
Wow, that's a pretty good memory.
Well, I remember I took care of the aquarium for at least a year or so before branching out into different fish.
So how did you get interested in breeding fish?
Well, I first just sort of read up on keeping the fish when I took over the aquarium because it was sort of a different thing. I was mostly keeping reptiles and amphibians before then, and I didn't really know much about fish. And the aquarium stores in our town there was only one at the time. It was pretty far away, at least a half an hour drive from where we lived. It was in the center of town. And back then they were these big metal frame aquariums with slate bottoms, and they were a little expensive for me being a youngster. And so what happened was the white cloud mountain fish, I saw them breed and throw eggs out and stuff. And of course, all the other fish ate them. Then I sort of started thinking, well, these fish breed. That's sort of interesting. So I started buying fish books about, different fish. And I finally bought one about angelfish. And, of course, it had a lot of knowledge and stuff about the breeding of angelfish. So that's when I started concentrating more on the angelfish.
And, I forgot to ask you at the very outset. So where did you grow up again, and where was all this taking place?
Well, I grew up in southeast Michigan, first near Detroit, and then when we had the aquarium, I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where the University of Michigan is. And I grew up there most of my life.
Okay. So I guess you said you went to University of Michigan. You told me that earlier. And so how did you go from, I guess, kind of this interest in fish to going wholeheartedly into the fish business?
Well, what happened was I got this aquarium I inherited from my younger brother, and then the angelfish actually spawned in there after the white cloud mountain fish on some plastic plants. And so I started, reading up on it, and then I realized they needed another aquarium to sort of start putting more fish away in the different areas. And so I started expanding the situation, and I actually moved into the basement, the aquariums into the basement, my parents' house, where at one point in time I probably had a little more than 20. But it was a slow process where I would accumulate another aquarium based on, breeding angelfish and raising them up and selling them. A couple of the aquariums I made were just sort of wooden framed ones with plastic sort of laid inside and filled with water. So I could actually, put small angelfish in and raise them up. So then during the high school era, I actually the 12th year, or my 12th grade in high school, last year, the senior in high school, I actually went home every lunch just to feed the angelfish, and I was selling them quite regularly to the stores that were in the area. By then, there was about 3 or 4 in our town instead of just one. And I sold quite a lot of angelfish, made a few $1,000s over the summertime and during the year, and it sort of helped pay for going to the university the next following year.
Wow. So, yeah, that's a lot of money even now. That's great.
Yeah.
So,
well, it was a lot of work, too. But
yeah, that's true.
I didn't pay myself, and I used my parents' electricity and so on, and all the equipment I raised by trading the fish. So, anyways, it sort of worked out. But then when I went to the university, I didn't have time for that anymore. And so it sort of slowly went back down to a normal sort of aquarium just holding facility there. My younger brother, a different brother, was taking care of it for the time being. And then I graduated university in 6 semesters, so I came out in 3 years. And then I went back to my hobby and started keeping different fish, mostly African cichlids. And then I would also breed them on the side just to supplement my income. What I was actually working for the medical center as a research assistant at that time.
So how did you end up in Florida from Michigan?
Well, I used to work for a wholesaler in Ann Arbor during one summer period, and he ended up going to Florida, and we sort of kept in touch here and there. And I'd buy some fish from him once in a while, and then he offered some of his space on a farm he was developing to start raising fish. And by then I had actually Old World Exotic Fish working. It was a business. So I found that, instead of raising them in a, wholesale warehouse environment where you had to heat the building and all that stuff, it was much cheaper to be in Florida. So I had a couple of partners at that point in time, and so we'd take turns going to Florida and sharing the fish farm facility with this other guy, and I ended up just staying in Florida after a while.
So is that where you guys are now, or is that the original
No,
site?
It's not the original site, but it's very close to the original site, yes.
Okay. So I guess back then when you first started out, versus kind of now, what are some overall major changes I guess you've seen in the cichlid world? Well,
when I first started in the early 70s with African cichlids, they were sort of new, and there was only a few species like Aratus and red zebras and cobalts and stuff. Like even Kenyais weren't known for a while. And then the interest sort of picked up, but they sort of filtered new fish into the hobby from the collectors on a sort of slow basis. So there really wasn't a huge accumulation of new species every year. So it'd be like 2 or 3 new Malawi species every year. And so it sort of built up like that. So in other words, the varieties were a lot less when I first started. And of course, all the technical stuff that we have in the office now is quite a bit different too. I remember at the beginning we used to, when people called us up and asked us what kind of fish we have, we used to read a stock list over the phone to the customer, to find out what they wanted to buy, or mail it to them in the post, which was pretty slow too. But Nowadays, of course, with emails and faxes and stuff like that, it's a lot faster. Now, the other thing, there wasn't as much competition as there is now for the same kind of fish, especially from the Far East. So in Europe and America, we really started with the Africans in the early 70s and 80s quite strong. As the Far East picked it up, it was more like the late 80s and early 90s. So the competition from the farms over there wasn't as keen as it is now.
Okay, so I guess can you tell us a little bit about your present facility?
Oh, the present one?
Yeah.
Well, we occupy a 5-acre facility in Homestead, Florida, and we also rent another 2.5-acre one just about 5 minutes from here. In combination, we have, I think there was about 86 in-ground ponds, which are sort of like a swimming pool size. They're generally about 20 by, well, say 50 by 20 and about 4 feet deep in general. There's some smaller ones and some a little bit bigger than that. And then we have several different sizes of concrete vats that we, above the ground, that we also house fish in. And there's about, let's see, on this facility there's about 500, and the other one, the other facility, there's about 100. So that's about 600 of the concrete vats. And then on this facility, the 5-acre facility, we have a building, a hatchery building. That one has about just short of 1,000 glass aquariums in there. We have 650 30-gallon flat breeders and 120 10-gallon tanks, and about 40 of these concrete vats also inside for breeding and housing fish.
Wow! So
and everything else is outside, of course. All the other vats and ponds are outside.
Right. Yeah. Definitely a big operation. And yeah, you guys, from what I remember, you guys have those kind of interesting, old coral reef type ponds, right?
Yeah. The soil around here, well, what they pass off for soil is really just an old coral reef. So the first 4 to 6 inches is sort of dirt mixed with sort of limestone rock from an old coral reef. This place used to be underwater for for a long time, so it was part of the ocean, but now it's dry. And then once you get below the 6-inch mark, it's just solid coral rock, and until you hit the water table, and of course below that as well. But the water table varies. It's pretty high, and it varies from about 5 feet to about 10 feet down, depending on what time of the year is and how much rain there's been.
So, where would you say most of your fish come from? And I know you obviously breed and import fish. How often are you getting shipments in to your facility?
Well, right now the business has been slacking off as a general rule in the aquarium industry and livestock especially. And we're getting shipments about once a week. And it used to be that we'd get shipments about 3 to 5 times a week. Here on our breeding facilities, we actually raise 200 different kinds of African cichlids. And then, of course, we supplement that with at least another 300 kind at any given time of whatever we import. And generally, we sort of breed the stuff that we can't buy readily because it's seasonal or hard to get or far away in the places where the exporters have to go, or hard to collect in big numbers, So we try to breed those, and then the things that, we can get readily from the established exporters and collectors, we don't breed as much, but we rather buy them as we need them and based on our sales.
So you've been involved with opening a lot of new areas to import fish. What were some of the, I guess, either horror or kind of cool stories you have, involved with doing that sort of work?
Well, there's 3 lakes where most of the African cichlids come from. One of the lakes is Lake Malawi, and that's surrounded by 3 different countries. And then another lake is Lake Tanganyika. That's surrounded by 4 countries. And then Lake Victoria is surrounded by another 3 countries. And I've been to most of the countries that neighbor all those places, and also some of the West African countries and Madagascar. And I've been instrumental in sort of bringing out and breeding Madagascar fish, Lake Victorian Basin fish, basically out of Uganda and Kenya, and also the Tanzanian side of Lake Malawi. Now, the Tanzanian side of Lake Malawi was not really open to people visiting for a long time because there was actually, from the 60s, there was a war between Tanzania and Malawi. I think there was only a couple skirmishes and a few shots fired, but the borders were closed and people didn't really go to the Tanzanian side. And Malawi, of course, claimed all the way up to the actual shoreline of the whole lake up to Tanzania, but technically, you couldn't go there and collect fish. It was not allowed. So The conflict finally thawed in the early 90s, and the border was open, and then people could go, adventurous people like me could go and start collecting in places that nobody had collected in before. And one of the times when we were actually traveling between, it was actually coming from Tanzania and going into Malawi, because we'd have to fly to Lilongwe, Malawi, to get. It used to fly to Dar es Salaam, but that's on the other side of the country in Tanzania from where the lake was. So it was over a day's journey to get from Dar es Salaam by road to the northern end of Lake Malawi. So I started going to Lilongwe, coming back and forth then. And one time when we were coming through Tanzania and into Malawi, we passed and got out. There was really no border crossing. There were buildings and customs, and none of that was there. I mean, eventually they made that within a few years, but we crossed over, got our passport stamps. We went into the Malawi side, and those guys were not expecting anybody to come down the road, and they pulled out their machine guns and rifles and pointed them at us and made us all get out of the car and lay on the ground while they searched the car. And then the guy I was with was basically saying, look, the border's open, you guys. What's the matter with you? Don't you know that, we're not doing anything wrong? And then they agreed, and then they stamped our passports and left us. That was a little hairy right there.
Yeah, definitely. Whenever anyone's shooting automatic weaponry at you or doing that sort of thing.
Pointing at us is good enough.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true. Pointing at it, that's what I mean. So, wow. So, yeah, that definitely did a lot of sacrificing for the hobby, I can see. What I want to do next after a break is talk to you a little bit more about some of the specific species that would be maybe of interest to some of the beginning hobbyists, and get kind of some feedback from you on all of that. So let's take a short break to hear from our sponsors, and then we'll continue our discussions of African cichlids with Laif right after these messages.
It's designerpetsweaters.com. Hand-knitted designer sweaters for your precious pup or cool cat. Beautiful couture patterns for your pets, including custom-knitted formal wear, casual wear, yachting, and even sports-themed. Many designer pet sweaters include feathered tammy hats, top hats, and a lot of sparkle. Each sweater includes leg loops, front paw sleeves, and leash opening. Visit designerpetsweaters.com to order your four-legged fashions today. Your pets will stay warm for the winter and be runway ready. Large or small, we fit them all. designerpetsweaters.com.
Let's talk pets
Let's talk pets
on Pet Life Radio.
Pet Life Radio.
PetLifeRadio.com.
We're back, and we're continuing our discussion with my guest, Laif DeMason of Old World Exotic Fish. So, Laif, you kind of talked a little bit about some of the hairy things that you went through just to get some fish into the country, and I know you started breeding a while ago. With your kind of early interest in angelfish and then working your way into Africans, you have a kind of feel for what fish would be good for folks to work on, and maybe what different types of interests they would have for some of these species. What would you consider some good species that you like for maybe a beginning hobbyist to consider?
You're talking about like African cichlid species?
Yeah, African cichlids.
Okay,
yeah.
Because I think they're a little bit, in general, a little bit more difficult than some of the other species of tropical fish that you can get in stores, like live bears and things like that. I would recommend for beginners. But if you're going into cichlids, I think the biggest thing that you should do is buy your fish when they're small and put them all into the tank at the same time together, small. I would recommend for most beginners are Malawi fish, just because a lot of the species, when they're small, have a lot of color and they're sort of interesting. Now, for a beginner, you have to remember that most African cichlids, most cichlids in general, but African cichlids tend to be a little bit territorial and aggressive, especially when they're older and bigger. So there's always going to be chasing around and stuff like that. But you just got to make sure you arrange your aquarium and start out when they're small, so that they sort of live together and get used to each other, and don't inflict any damage that could be. Normally in the wild, if a fish is chasing another one, it swims away, far away, and it never comes back. But in the aquarium, of course, it can't get away. So you're going to have to protect those individuals from too much aggression by any one individual within your tank. what I was going to say, that what I recommend is the Malawi fish, just because they're colorful. Now, if you don't like fish rearranging an aquarium, because some cichlids can be really great diggers. They dig around and they move the ground around. They heap it over to one side of the aquarium and make big holes in the tank all the way to the bottom. And so it's somewhat unsightly. And they dig up plants and even plastic plants and they move them around. If you're sort of trying to avoid that when you're a beginner, I would not recommend any Melanochromis species of the Malawi cichlids because they dig quite a lot, especially when they're older.
What are some of the common names, I guess, for some of these fish? And for example, like the
well, most of the common names, like Melanochromis auratus, which is I'm sort of trying to get people away from that if they don't like the digging aspect. But what I would recommend is something like a cobalt zebra, which is a Calanos, Metroclima calanos. We use the Latin names, but they change them so often that some people can't follow the one name. Before that was Pseudotrophia zebra, and so if you don't know the whole history of the nomenclature, sometimes it's confusing, especially for the beginners. But a lot of the stores will use the old sort of common name handles like cobalt zebra or white zebra or red zebra. All those are pretty good for beginners. There's, like Kenyais are not bad. That's Pseudotrophus lombardoi or Metroclima now lombardoi. And, things like that, they have colors. I would, rusty cichlids are all another one. There's things like that I would recommend for the beginner.
Because it actually is one of my favorite fish, but I know it's probably one of the, I'm assuming you can correct me, but one of the more territorial ones too. You have a fish named after yourself, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Pseudotrophus DeMason.
It's a beautiful fish, but that's pretty aggressive, isn't it?
It's pretty aggressive. It's related to... it's related to elongatus type, and those elongatus types are generally a little bit more aggressive than the zebra types. Labidochromis are also good, but they can be aggressive depending on the situation. But for a beginner, like I say, if you start small, you might be able to get away with, even putting DeMasonized in the same tank. But as they get bigger, there's gonna be some dye here and there. So they sort of fit into the arena that you give them. Given time. When they're small, they're not as territorial as when they're bigger. Although I would say the DeMasonized do chase the other fish around quite a bit and nip their fins. So
they've got a really beautiful kind of bright blue sort of color. And I always meant to ask you if they were named after you because they're so aggressive. Is that like?
Yeah, they were named after me. Not because they're so aggressive.
I'm kidding. So what kind of, I guess, densities are you talking now? And actually, maybe just to give some of the folks who aren't familiar with these, what sort of sizes do they get to, when they're...
Well, typically Malawi fish and most Tanganyikan fish get to only about 3 to 5 inches. They're not really humongously big fish. There are some that are bigger and there are some that are smaller. Now, when you buy them small in the store, they'll be usually at 1.5 inches. I would recommend 1.5 inches, 2 inches. But make sure you get them sort of all the same size. And I would also recommend not getting one of this and one of that and one of this and one of that. You should get like 4 to 6 of one thing, 4 to 6 of another. And I wouldn't really start any Malawi cichlid aquarium off without starting with at least a 29-gallon aquarium. Smaller than that's just too small. So as always with the cichlids, I would recommend getting the biggest aquarium that you can afford because it's going to help you in the long run, not only the water quality, but also the fish are going to be able to deal with their own personalities and behaviors in a bigger aquarium rather than a smaller aquarium. So in a 29, if you start with a 29, I would put like 20 to 36 1.5 small Malawi fish in there, what we call mbunas, which are the rock-dwelling cichlids from Lake Malawi. And they usually have color when they're small. And that would be a good setup. Now, after 3-4 years, you're not going to have 36. They're not going to be. There's probably going to be more like, maybe 25 left. But they'll generally get along. But if you buy 25 3 or 4 inch aquarium or Malawi fish and put them in an aquarium at the same time, they're going to beat each other up and kill each other. So it will be a disaster doing it the other way around.
So you mentioned water quality a little bit. What kind of water quality do these fish prefer, and what do hobbyists have to consider when they're looking at water quality for these?
The biggest problem that most people do not compensate for in African cichlids is the fact that they come from hard alkaline water system. Now, they don't need hard and alkaline water to live. They can go with neutral water and a medium hardness. But the fact of the matter is they're really actually very sensitive to ammonia waste, just like saltwater fish. So once you get a pH around 8 or 8.3, like a saltwater tank, the ammonia waste in the water is 10 times more toxic than a neutral pH. So you have to remember, you can't see ammonia in the water. It's invisible. It's clear, just like the water. So they don't always die straight away from the high ammonia toxicity, but they will get sick very easily. So you have to keep an idea out for this ammonia waste and not feed your fish when you first set them up. Do not feed the fish very much at all. They won't starve, I'm sure, for a couple of weeks. Just very hold back on the food until the ammonia cycles get all established, and then you can go ahead and feed a little bit more. But the biggest common problem for this ammonia waste is that people overfeed their fish, and therefore they build up a lot of waste. And the waste they pick up in their gills, and they can't get rid of it out of their body because they pick it back up in their gills. So you have to do water changes. And when I was keeping Malawi fish and African fish in aquariums, I would do more than a 50% water change like every 2 weeks.
Okay. And yeah,
but
maybe just,
you don't have to do that, but you certainly have to change water every couple of weeks.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and maybe just to reiterate, definitely makes sense for them to obviously have a water quality test kit, or if they have a way to test their water, if they're not, able to change it as much, at least they'll have an idea. And that's definitely. I know it's really hard not to want to feed these guys, as they kind of come up to the tank and look.
Yeah, they beg like dogs. Just any wild animal is going to be very impulsive to get food if they know the food is easily available. But it's really not the best thing for them to be fed a lot all the time, because a lot of the food that are manufactured are very high in protein. And the fact of the matter is, in the wild, they get food and they nibble just scant amount of food every day, and most of the food the things that they eat don't have any nutritional value. So the protein content is very, very low in the wild. Whereas, of course, they're always driven to eat because of this. But in an aquarium setting, the protein value and the nutritional value of the food is very high, and so they're getting a lot more than what they would get in the wild just from one feeding.
So would you recommend maybe some of these more specialty kind of cichlid type diets, or what do you recommend?
Well, the cichlid diets are basically for color, bringing out color, which they're good for, and they'll develop the stronger color, because cichlids in general, I mean, there's herbivore cichlids and there's predator cichlids, and not all cichlids do the same thing in the wild. They have different niches and they feed different things, but in general, it's based on the algae that's grown in the lake. On the rocks that are the reefs that make up Lake Malawi and Tanganyika and Victoria. So the algae has a lot of keratin in it, color components, and it brings out the color. Now, if you don't give your fish, higher quality food with a little bit of keratin in it, then, or let's see, for us, it's very easy because they're outside and they get natural sunlight and algae that way. But if you have a prepared food, it's not going to have a high enough keratin content to keep them completely in color all the time. So a lot of people go with these specialized cichlid diets just to keep their colors at their peak, and even actually overdose them on that stuff so that they develop more color than they would in the wild, which is possible. But along with those keratins and things that are in the food is also high protein. So people forget that, you can't just, I would recommend actually feeding the fish maybe only 4 times a week on pellet food. Now, you can feed them flake food, which is not usually as high protein, and it's sort of more bulkier, so they can't overeat as easily with flake food. But, the days that you don't feed them with pellets, just feed them flake food.
Okay.
That's it. They'll be fine, and they'll grow still, too, I mean, a lot of times here, we just feed the stuff in the hatchery from the wild. We just feed them flake food while we're maintaining them here just to sell. We're not really trying to put growth on them. We're just trying to keep them healthy until they're sold, but you don't even feed them pellet food.
Okay. So I guess, and maybe going back to the fish in the hatchery and breeding, I know many people in the cichlid associations are real fascinated by the breeding. Can you maybe give us a kind of brief intro to some of the African cichlid breeding methods?
Well, yeah, most of the breeding methods of African cichlids, all of Malawi cichlids, the cichlids from Lake Malawi, are mouth brooders. The females brood the eggs in the mouth and the progeny, the young in the mouth. So what will happen will be sort of the males take out a territory, and they have the wild, vivid colors to attract the females. The females come and breed when they're ready, and then they move off, holding the young in their mouth. So a lot of people try to reproduce this by having several females to one male, although I don't think that's the best idea. What we usually do is put one male to every 5 females. Because first of all, if we want genetic variability, we don't want one male breeding all the time with the females, because it narrows the gene pool, and it also makes, down the road, when we grow up the young to new breeders, it'll make it brother-sister crosses where, it'll be sort of a line-bred fish. We try to keep the gene pool very big, so we put more males than most people do in their aquariums to breed them. And this also has another effect. The other effect is that the males chase each other around a little bit more than chasing the females when there's only one male in the tank. Now, the other mechanism where most of the several Tanganyikan fish are also mouth brooders, like Frontosas and Tropheus and Duboises and things like that. But there are a lot of Lamprologines like Julidochromys and Ultralamprologus and Lamprologus that do breed sort of like an angelfish. They breed in pairs, and the females lay their eggs on a nest that they guard or substrate or a cave mostly, and the male fertilizes them, and they are substrate spawners, so they adhere to the hard surface, and they guard the nest and the progeny when they hatch out. Those fish you're going to have to feed like bride shrimp, maybe bride shrimp hatched out, because they're quite smaller than the mouth brooder fish from Malawi or Tanganyika.
So based on, I guess, or what are the pluses and minuses then? If you're, if someone knows that fish they have in the store are imported versus maybe bred domesticated fish, what would you?
Well,
what would you
there's
say
a lot of pluses and minuses. Imported fish are going to be more expensive. Let's face it; they're caught halfway around the world. Sometimes they're decompressed for a day or two to bring them up to the surface. Then they're sent on an airplane all the way across the world. Then they're sort of unpacked and repacked and finally get to your tank. Now, those wild fish, in my opinion, generally are smaller than the farm fish or the domestic fish, which is good because they color up and they're smaller. But also their fecundity seems to be, their willingness to breed seems to be way higher than any fish you raise. So those are pluses. Okay, now the minuses would be that they would have, obviously exposure to parasites and stuff from the wild. Well, that's the reason why you need to quarantine all your fish. And we actually quarantine everything here for a week and prophylactically treat them to get rid of all the parasites that they may come in with before we start selling them. So when we import the fish, they're here for a whole week. We clean them up the best we can, both externally and internally, before we put them out to sale, so that you guys won't have to deal with that. But then again, there's always going to be some chance that they're going to harbor some parasite, whether it's an ectoparasite or an internal parasite, that would be able to be spread into your system too. So that would be a negative.
Well, I've got probably a 1,000 more questions for you, but unfortunately we're out of time. Definitely want to thank you, Laif, and our producers, especially Mark Winter, for making the show possible. Before we go, Laif, did you have any final words or anything you wanted to impart to our listeners?
Well, I encourage everybody to keep fish. I mean, it's an interesting hobby. It teaches you a lot about biology, and it's kept me going for a long time. And one of the fascinating things about African cichlids is there's so many different kinds and groups of African cichlids. There's peacocks, and there's Lamprologus, and there's Frontosa. If one goes out of fashion or out of style, then there's always another one people graduate to, and it's always something that keeps interest up no matter how long you're in the hobby. Now, the other thing I'd recommend is we also put out a magazine called Cichlid News Magazine. There's a web page I think there'll be a link on the forum link here, and
yes,
you
definitely
can go ahead and click on that and take a look and see if it's a quarterly magazine exclusively about cichlids, oriented towards advanced hobbyists, but certainly young guys just getting into it could certainly read it too.
Sounds good. Well, thanks very much again, Laif. You were wealth of information, and I think hopefully got a lot of folks out there even more interested in aquarium keeping and cichlids. So please be sure to check out Laif's web pages on Aquariumania. We'll have the links he mentioned on there. I encourage all of you to visit my Aquariumania blog on Pet Life Radio. Also, if you have any questions, comments, or ideas for a show, email me at Dr. Roy, that's DRROY, at PetLifeRadio.com. Dr. Roy at PetLifeRadio.com. If you're ever in Florida, please be sure to visit the Aquariumania exhibit at the Florida Aquarium in Tampa. Definitely one of my favorite aquariums. Until next time, visit your local aquarium stores and make sure to keep your tanks clean and your fish healthy.
Let's Talk Pets, every week on demand, only on PetLifeRadio.com.